February 14th, 1920. And we work to improve our systems of government and impact public policies through voter education and advocacy. And our briefings, like the one tonight, serve as voter education and can often lead to advocacy as well. If we could have the agenda, Andrea, we'll talk about that for a second. So obviously I'm doing the introduction to Zoom and chat. Marty will take over in a minute for upcoming briefings. Sue Stark will introduce our speaker. And then at the end, there will be questions and discussions. So before I hand this over to Marty to talk about upcoming events, some housekeeping notes. We've muted everyone to make sure that we can all hear our speaker clearly. And we're also recording this session, I believe, Andrea, right?
Right.
And please use the chat feature to ask questions during the talk. For those of you that are new to chat, you can send to the whole group or to an individual. For the questions, please send to all. You can hit enter and then it will show up and everyone can see it. The chat area has also turned out to be a really good area for a good place for sharing information with each other. So you don't have to use it just for questions. I will be watching all those questions and I'll be back at the end to present the questions to our speaker. So with that, I'll hand it over to Marty Sloan.
Good evening. I'm the Director of Program and I'm happy to welcome all of you this evening. I just wanted to make a couple of announcements. We're very excited about tonight's briefing, and we're also excited about March. Tuesday, March 16th, we will have Carol Hedges, who is the co-founder and CEO of Colorado Fiscal Institute until she retires very soon, or I guess not so soon. And she's going to speak to us. Usually she speaks to us about Tabor and makes it actually very interesting. But she's going to speak to us on a very different topic, and that is racial roots. And it's a historical look at some of the policies and other legislative issues and other policies that have created and maintained racism in our country. Another extremely important topic, as is this evening's. We will have a April briefing. It's still in the planning stages, but keep your eye out for that. We will also have our second Zoom annual meeting in May 15th. Last year, we were all amazed. It was our first Zoom event, and it was very well attended. And I think we've done pretty well keeping in touch over the year. I hope that you are keeping up with the Thursday emails and the voter. We're trying to make the voter, which is the last week of every month, a little bit different than the emails, a little bit more substantive. And if some of you have ideas for longer articles for that voter, we would welcome them. So now I want to thank Sue Stark for organizing this evening's briefing, and she will now introduce tonight's speaker. Thank you.
Thanks, Marty. I see from the agenda that I have no time to introduce her, but I'm going to take some time.
My fault.
It is my pleasure to introduce Denise Maes, who is the public policy director for the Colorado ACLU. In this role, she oversees all legislative initiatives that affect civil liberties at the state and local levels in Colorado. She also sits on various, relative to this particular topic, various municipal boards and commissions that review policies about policing and jail reform. I first contacted Denise in November and asked her if she would come to do a follow-up presentation after we had State Representative Leslie Herod speak to our kickoff meeting in September, sort of in response to what was then being called the defund the police movement, but more in response to what was happening in Colorado with the passage of Senate Bill 217 and what was happening in the city of Denver in response to programs related to the protests that occurred in Denver and policing related to those protests. So as you mentioned, it's a really cold night. It's also President's day to day. And of course, we've all been hearing about the two presidents' tenures who were, that we celebrate today, not just as a day off from work. But George Washington and the framers of the Constitution have been mentioned a lot in the previous week. And of course, Abraham Lincoln and the response to, shall I say, the last time this country came close to having its democracy defiled, maybe. So I think it is important, but the other thing that I think is really important about February is this is Black Lives, this is Black History Month. And of course, this was such an important year in the history of the anti-racism movement in this country. And as tonight will reveal, how that has impacted policing. So I told you I contacted Denise in November. Little did we know that the occurrences that have happened since then, particularly on January 6th, would take place. I had asked her initially to do a follow-up to Leslie's presentation and to let us know a little bit about how 217 was being enacted and impacting us in the state, and to ask her also about what was happening in Denver around police reform. Then January 6th happened, and I contacted her and her said, I think we also need to have you address the issues of under-policing, of who gets policed depending on their cultural, racial, economic backgrounds as well. So those are the things that I've asked her to address. I want you to know a little bit more about her. Denise is a native of Taos, New Mexico. She graduated from the University of New Mexico School of Law. She was the first generation college student in her family. And she's an experienced environmental attorney who has worked on a number of high-profile hazardous waste and environmental justice cases. She's an expert in both municipal and administrative law and land use issues. So she has a really broad repertoire of both policy and legislative experience. After being named one of Denver's top 7 women lawyers by Law Week, Colorado in 2009, she left the private law firm at which she was a partner to serve as general counsel for the White House Office of Administration in the executive office of President Barack Obama. And she also directed the budget and finance efforts for the office of Vice President, then, now President Joe Biden. Denise returned to Colorado because she had strong ties here and had a passion for working in the areas of civil rights and social justice. Denise calls Colorado home. She has served as chair of the Denver Hispanic Chamber of Commerce, chair of Mikasa Resource Center for Women, director of the Downtown Denver Partnership, director of the Colorado Women's Bar and Hispanic Bar Associations, and was director and co-founder of the Latina Initiative. This is not somebody who has moss growing under her anywhere. She is celebrated in the legal, business, social justice, and Latino communities. She was lauded in 2010 as Barrister of the Year by the Gay, Lesbian, Bisexual, and Transgender Community Center of Colorado, known as the Center. We and the ACLU of Colorado are, I think, so lucky to have her here. And I will let her now present to you important information about what's happening in the realm of policing and civil rights. Thanks for joining us, Denise.
Thank you, Susan. And really the only, the main reason why I have a resume that took a little long for Susan to read is what happens when you get old. You just get the opportunity to throw more things on there. So, but I thank you, Susan, for the introduction, and thank you for the invitation. And I hope that I hit the mark of what you were hoping that I would do. I hope it'll all tie together. And thank you, Andrea, for managing the PowerPoint. I'm not able to walk and chew gum at the same time, so I do appreciate this. So we'll go to the next slide and we'll start here. So Juneteenth is the day that we celebrate the end of slavery on June 19th. This year, or last year, I should say, June 19th, 2020, was a little different. Across the country, people were filling the streets, protesting police brutality and white supremacy, and seeking to defund police altogether. These protests were sparked by the murder of George Floyd by the Minneapolis police officers. Now, May 25th, 2020 was a memorable day. It is a memorable one for race relations. It began as a simple report from a store clerk about a possible $20 counterfeit bill. Now, you see, Mr. Floyd visited that store regularly, as he did that day on May 25th. He paid for cigarettes, as he usually did, and he used a $20 bill. Soon thereafter, after Mr. Floyd had purchased his cigarettes, he sat in his car and police arrived. And before he knew it, they were attempting to get Mr. Floyd to get out of his car. And in fact, one of the police officers drew their gun. And we don't really know what was the whole point of that. They tried to get Mr. Floyd out of the car. He resisted at first. Eventually, he conceded. He was immediately handcuffed. Now, I want all of you to realize that at this point in time, or really, frankly, ever, there is no proof or anything even close to that that would suggest that Mr. Floyd has committed a crime. All we have is Mr. Floyd went to a store, paid for cigarettes with a $20 bill, and a clerk thinks the bill, and we don't even know if it's his bill that the clerk thinks is counterfeit. Now, former police officer Chauvin shows up. He was then a police officer. He shows up at the scene and shoves Mr. Floyd to the ground. Now, Mr. Floyd is handcuffed, so there really was no need to slam him to the ground, but he did. And this is when the witnesses began to film. For 7 minutes and 46 seconds, then Officer Chauvin kept his knee on Mr. Floyd's neck. Mr. Floyd said he could not breathe. Repeatedly, he moaned the words, "Please, please." And 20 times he pled for his mom. 6 minutes into Mr. Chauvin's knee into Mr. Floyd's neck, he went limp, and he was later pronounced dead. Protests against police brutality began immediately on May 26th, and they have persisted in ways not ever seen before. The protests were not only in Minneapolis, as we all know, they were actually all over the country and even other parts of the world. There were protests here in Denver consistently. There were many protests in Aurora when the media started to focus on the death of Elijah McClain. Protesters here and all over the country, they would lay in the streets for 7 minutes and 46 seconds and chant, "I cannot breathe." The protesters, in ways not seen before, were broad and diverse in age, race, ethnicity, gender, and gender identity. Next slide. Now, except for the video of then Officer Chauvin seemingly proudly holding his knee on Mr. Floyd's neck, I don't really know what the spark was for the protests and why the pitch became as loud. Because you see, Mr. Floyd was not the first Black man brutalized and murdered by police. Indeed, that list is long. Just in our recent memory, we have Eric Gardner, Akai Gurley, Breonna Taylor, Michael Brown, Tamir Rice, Walter Scott, Alton Cernley, Freddie Gray, Philando Castile, Tanisha Anderson, Ahmaud Arbery. And mind you, the offenses, and I say offenses in quotes, that initiated police contacts were things so minor: a broken taillight, selling cigarettes for cheap on the street, a possible counterfeit $20 bill, selling bootleg DVDs, jogging in the streets. For goodness sakes, these actions, even if substantiated, wouldn't land one of us in jail, and yet it cost them their lives. George Floyd and all the others and more reflect a reality that we must acknowledge and we must own. And it is this: how easy it is to take the life of a person of color, and how difficult it is to hold people accountable for so easily disregarding Black bodies. Where we are today is not simply the result of a moment in time, but it is the result of a long, long history of slavery, Jim Crow laws, redlining, institutionalized racism, pure and simple. There is so much to unpackage and analyze when it comes to where we are today on race and race relations. I think a lot of that is perhaps beyond the scope of this talk, but it sounds like you are going to get into it a little bit more. But I did want to give a little bit of a backdrop, or that actually is a backdrop, all of those protests that really did lead to Senate Bill 217, which is the Law Enforcement Accountability Bill. Now, I know that Representative Leslie Herod visited with you at your last meeting and discussed Senate Bill 217, and she was one of 4 sponsors that championed this important piece of legislation. The ACLU, of course, is grateful for their work. In many respects, this law is precedent, it's history making. In many respects, and hopefully it can be a sign of things to come, not only here in Colorado, but throughout the country. We don't tout this piece of legislation as being transformative. It doesn't change police altogether, but it certainly does bring about the reforms that many have been wanting for years. Now on this slide, I am showing some of the elements of the bill, some of its highlights. I won't get into the specifics of the bill, as I'm sure that Representative Herod already did, and some of it is a little bit in the weeds, but I'm also happy to answer any other questions that you might have. But some of the things here are pretty important. For one, there will be mandatory body cameras on all police officers all over the state. There's going to be required data collection. So for example, there's a lot of suspicion, I think for good reason, that police stop and search people of color more often than their white counterparts. Well, we don't have the data to prove it. So I think this data collection element is important. The bill outlaws, the use of chokeholds. So the kind of the chokehold that was at the genesis of Mr. Floyd's death. Police officers cannot shoot at someone who they think is fleeing from the scene of a crime. That was known as the fleeing felon. There's also now a duty for a police officer to intervene when they see bad police behavior. What we also found in the state of Colorado is that you can be fired from one police department because of bad policing, because of use of excessive force, but then you could just go next door and get a job at the next police department. And that happens all the time, a revolving door of police officers going from one law enforcement agency to another. And so this now will have a database where you can check, a municipality can see whether or not this officer has had any complaints against him or her, whether or not those complaints have been substantiated, whether the police officer has been disciplined, etc. It also will protect protesters from the use of tear gas and projectiles that police were using, simply ad hoc during a lot of the protests that we saw. And it also authorizes our Colorado Attorney General to bring lawsuits against police departments that have a pattern and practice of police officers always being found wrongly to have used excessive force. And actually, this is now is the basis for an investigation that the Attorney General Phil Weiser has now opened in the Elijah McClain case. So we can go now to the next slide. Senate Bill 217, we hope, of course, is not the end of police reform. There's still so much more work to do. At least the ACLU sees the landscape of law enforcement accountability to only be in many ways at its beginning. So we also acknowledge that Senate Bill 217 gave us a unique window a unique window of opportunity. I mean, you could hear the chants of Black Lives Matter while this bill was being debated and considered in committee and votes were being taken. I've heard it said that timing is everything, and indeed, the sponsors of Senate Bill 217 knew that that was true, and they capitalized on a moment. And we are, of course, thankful and grateful that they did. Future reforms may not have the same momentum, but we sure as heck want to try. And again, it'll be the same legislative sponsors and others that are at the ready to move legislation forward. And here's what we're hoping to see. And I, again, have put some bullet points here just to give you kind of a high view of what we are thinking. The legislative session, incidentally, starts tomorrow. Bills will be introduced starting tomorrow. And they will, I don't know when a bill like this will be introduced. You'll have to stay tuned to our website as we try to give updated information. But these are some of the reforms that we're talking about. For example, we want to end no-knock warrants. And that's when police, if they think you might be destroying evidence or hiding an offender or potentially even a witness, they can just barge into your house. And that is precisely what led to the death of Breonna Taylor. So that is one thing that we are gonna try to put an end to. We also want to take militarized equipment away from police departments. There was a federal program where the federal government was giving away old military equipment to law enforcement. La Plata County owns a tank, for example. I have no idea why they would need a tank. It'll end resisting arrest when there is no legal authority to detain. It will also stop officers from shooting at moving vehicles. And many of you may recall the death of Jessie Hernandez by Denver police. She was fleeing away in a car. They shot at the car and they killed her. So that is what we hope to see in the 2021 legislative session coming up, which starts tomorrow. We'll go to the next slide. So this is what I think is, kind of interesting, that kind of looks at the contrast, if you will, of how the police responded to protests over the summer and early fall. Black Lives Matter protesters are sitting in the street to protest the police killing of George Floyd, and yet they are met with police officers in full riot gear, tear gas, rubber bullets, batons. And when Black people protest for their lives to matter, they are met with National Guard troops, police equipped with assault weapons, rifles, shields, SWAT teams, tear gas, and more. And that didn't happen, of course, as we know, with the Capitol mob, which I'll show in a little bit. We can go now actually to the next slide. Here you can see where police officers have shot, beaten, and even used cars to run down protesters in the Black Lives Matter protests, leaving some with permanent disabilities. The individual on the right-hand side, the older gentleman, 75 years old, he was pushed down by a police officer And only last week was the police officer found to have acted reasonably, and there will be no disciplinary action taken against that police officer. Shantia Love out of Boston, she was permanently blinded by a rubber bullet. And that police officer similarly, well, they don't really know which police officer, since these sort of things is just kind of a free-for-all of throwing all sorts of things. We can go to the next slide. And then here we see the only a few hundred Capitol police officers were able to become mobilized to face the individuals that were going to be protesting at the Capitol on January 6th. And you see on the left-hand side, Trump supporters scaling the walls of the Capitol during the insurrection. I think these are perfect contrasts. You'll find, of course, the other photos and videos that went viral of Capitol Police taking photos and selfies with some of the protesters, police officers helping individuals downstairs, all that sort of thing. Now, on January 6th, we saw one of the most brutal riots on American soil in our time. If you tuned in at all over the last week, you would have seen heartbreaking and gut-wrenching footage of the riot at our nation's Capitol. The impeachment managers, showed footage that had never been seen before or aired before. I found it difficult to watch and understand if many of you looked the other way, as I did on occasion. As the riot was occurring, many could not help but contrast how the Black Lives Matter protests of the summer were handled and contrast to what was happening on January 6th. And all of these slides here are but one that intends to give you that comparison and contrast. We can go to, well, actually, yeah, we can go to the next slide. Well, let's stay right there for a minute. That's fine, I'm sorry. What I was gonna say in closing on this part is, I know that right now we actually don't know a lot about what happened on January 6th in terms of preparation for the riot, who knew what, when, and the role that the former occupant of the White House played. But all of that is yet to be explored and uncovered. Nonetheless, we cannot ignore how law enforcement treated the many protesters for Black Lives Matter and how they were continually demonized in so many ways by the Trump administration and by Trump himself. And that demonization continued by Trump's lawyers during the impeachment during the impeachment trial. Now, I cannot speak about racial and ethnic inequity without talking about what is happening today. And I promise that I'll link all of this up. Thank you. I was just going to say, next slide. I say often that the COVID-19 virus is not racist, but it sure has uncovered our racist history. The virus is on its way to flattening, and we certainly hope that that flattening continues. But there is one story, and I really do believe it is not often enough told, and it baffles me that it isn't often enough told. And that is that our brown, Black, and Indigenous people are being affected disproportionately by this virus. Now, this is not because communities of color are somewhat more predisposed to the virus than their white counterparts. No, rather, these inequities are the result of generations of institutionalized barriers to medical care, to stable housing, to healthy food, to clean air, to education, and to reliable transportation. Because of institutionalized and historic racism, people of color are more likely to have an underlying condition that makes them more susceptible to the virus and potentially, even worse, more likely to die from it. People of color also constitute a workforce less able to work from home. They are more likely to be performing those essential job functions that we take for granted. They are the home health care worker, the RTD bus driver, the individual that is stocking the shelves at your grocery store and preparing the food at some of your favorite restaurants. Now, some people may refer to these workers as heroes. But I think the story is actually darker. They are workers that are woefully underpaid, historically unappreciated, and often with inadequate healthcare. Now, the numbers I have put on this slide really do tell the story. Black people account for 4% of Colorado's population, and yet they are almost double of their percentage of the population of COVID cases, and they are 7% of all deaths. Our Latina community represent just over 21% of Colorado's population, but they account for 35% of COVID cases. And we're seeing that disparity continue through vaccines. The Black and Latinx Coloradans account for only 1.8% and 4.3% of people receiving the vaccine. There are a variety of reasons to explain the vaccine disparities. Part of it is for good reason. There's a lot of suspicion in the Black and Latino community because our communities have been used as guinea pigs for all sorts of medications. And so there is some suspicion about what is really happening with the vaccine. But the other reason is because there has been very little coordinated outreach to communities to actually be there in the community instead of having a long line at the Pepsi Center where individuals that are elderly or don't have easy access to public transportation simply can't get to the vaccine. So that's a racial disparity that's happening today, and we need not look very far to see it. We can go to the next slide. The race and ethnic disparities of the virus could not be more profound and stark than in our jails and prisons. You see, we in America have an addiction, and we have an addiction to jails and prisons. Our nation incarcerates more people than any other nation in the world. And not surprising, given our racist history, we disproportionately incarcerate Brown and Black people. African Americans are approximately 15.5% of our nation's population, but they are more than double of our prison population. The Latino population nationwide is 16.7% of our population, but 30% of our prison population. Approximately 32% of individuals that are serving a life without parole sentence are Black, and 33% of people serving life with parole are Black. And again, it's not as if miraculously people of color are more inclined to commit crimes. Rather, the incarceration rates of Black and Brown people really underscore, again, our history of racism. You see, communities of color are over-policed and as a result arrested at a greater rate. There are extreme sentencing disparities between people of color and their white counterparts. Also, our war on drugs persistently incarcerates African Americans at alarming rates, despite the fact that drug use is generally equal among all races. Our prison system was founded on racist principles. Although we incarcerate more people than any other nation in the world, the data shows us, ironically, we are no safer. We have devastated so many families and have left many children growing up in single-parent homes. Michelle Alexander is author of one of my favorite books, Mass Incarceration and the New Jim Crow. She wrote, "Who is behind bars has more to do with our collective choices rather than the individual choices of the people in those cages." Mass incarceration, simply stated, is a racial justice issue, as is police reform and accountability. Both remain as vestiges of slavery and our Jim Crow laws. And today, these prisons are death traps. Prisons are a virus's delight. There is no way that one in prison or in jail can adhere to any of the CDC guidelines regarding COVID-19. There's no such thing as 6 feet distancing. Individuals that are housed there stand shoulder to shoulder in line for showers, to use the phone. They sleep 2 or maybe even 3 to a jail cell. They use the same toilet. A not widely told story here is that in Colorado, our largest COVID-19 outbreak is in our prisons. Hundreds have tested positive, almost thousands, and many have died. And the individuals that will die there, they will be older, they will be frail, and they will be Black, and they will be brown, all caught up in an inequitable system. So when we say Black Lives Matter, we gotta mean all Black lives. And when we chant Black Lives Matter, we don't chant that as a way to say that other lives don't. But that phrase, those words do bring attention to the fact that our country, our government, has treated Black bodies as if they didn't matter. Laws that more heavily penalize crack cocaine than cocaine itself, stop and frisk laws that pretty much guaranteed that Black and brown, mainly men, would be subject to arrest. George Floyd, say his name. You probably didn't know that he had been stopped by police a dozen times before that fatal day. His life experience did not differ from the lives of other Black and Latinos. Targeted and profiled, and the cycle repeats. Now, November 3rd was a good day, and January 20th, Inauguration Day, perhaps a better one. The ACLU challenged the former administration on so many fronts. We filed hundreds of lawsuits against the Trump administration. And although President Biden does promise a better day, no one person can tackle the racial tension and inequity that plagues our nation. It will take a village of many. I think the way all of this ties together is pretty simple. That at the root of a lot of our racial tension and the root of our racial problems, a lot of it is found in law enforcement. Police can bring you into the criminal legal system. District attorneys and judges keep you in. And we know that there is a profound discrepancy. We're hoping to take care in part of the law enforcement issues, but I also don't want you to lose sight of what's happening in our states, in Colorado's prisons. I'm going to end with, hopefully on a little bit of a higher note, and leave you with 2 parting comments. Oftentimes when I do this presentation, I am reminded by a passage I read in a book, and the author refers to an etching he saw at Notre Dame in Paris, and it read, "The future belongs to those that bring it the greatest hope." And I think that is our collective task, to indeed bring hope. And I think Amanda Gorman, our wonderful National Youth Poet Laureate to whom we were introduced on Inauguration Day, I think she tells us how we bring that hope. She said, "Let every dawn find us courage." And I hope that we can all find that courage together. And thank you very much for your attention. And I am more than happy to answer any questions folks may have. I've seen some in the chat. Happy to open up the chat, or if anybody wanted to moderate it all, let me know.
I am going to moderate it. This is Pearl Ann.
Great.
And quite a lovely speech. Thank you very much. Learned things and certainly felt things, right?
I hope so. I hope so.
Yes, absolutely. Oh shoot, my chat just went away. Sorry. A bunch of questions are coming in. So first, will there be any bills to address incarceration rates here in Colorado?
Yes, I think there will be at least a couple of them. One, for example, here's one of the things that we have found during the COVID era is we really pushed for Governor Polis to try to release more people from prison. And most particularly, we focused on individuals who might be elderly or frail or more susceptible to the virus. And there is something in the prison system, it's called special needs parole. And so if you have one of these underlying conditions, you supposedly should be able to apply for special needs parole, and the parole board would, assuming you get a favorable recommendation from the parole board, you would be able to get out. Well, one of the things that we discovered is, it's a lot easier to get into that prison than it is to get out, because getting special needs parole is actually a really big ordeal. Only certain types of special needs apply. There is no timeline, so you can apply and years can go by before there's any response to it. Lots of problems with that system. And so there will be some legislation put forward that will try to correct that really arcane process, hopefully make it a little easier. And I want to remind people that we are only talking about people that can be safely released into the community. So certainly not any individual who might present any kind of criminal risk to the community. So that's number one. You'll also see a second bill, number 2, that will try to tackle felony murder. And without getting too wonky on you, because I have a tendency to do that, is you can be at the scene of a crime with your buddy, be sitting in the getaway car, and your buddy goes in to rob a Circle K and it all goes bad and the buddy kills the store clerk. You in the getaway car are just as guilty of murder as the person who actually shot the individual in the store. And so what we're trying to do is separate those two and treat them differently. One is guilty of murder. One is definitely guilty of a crime, but the crime is not murder. So those are 2 bills for sure that that we hope will move forward this session.
So there's a couple more that follow in with that topic. Is the ACLU working with Dean Williams, the head of the DOC, on any prison reforms now? And also, where is DA Beth McCann on SB 217?
District Attorney McCann was supportive of Senate Bill 217. She did give some good testimony in the House Judiciary Committee hearing. The district attorneys ultimately, as a whole, came out neutral on the bill. I think there were a lot of district attorneys that liked parts of the bill and not other parts of the bill, but generally they were neutral. Beth McCann was supportive. I think Director Williams is a terrific guy. I think he does have some really, really good ideas for reforming the system. I think what he is finding, which is not unusual, is that there's a lot of bureaucracy and there's a lot of administrative things that need to be addressed. And so he does need the legislature to help him to make sure certain laws are in place that he can exercise more discretion. And this special needs parole is one avenue for that. And then we're also hoping that we could put more pressure on the governor to use his clemency power to let people out of prison. So those are definitely 2 individuals that we're working with.
So a comment, I understood that there's been some improvements in Colorado prisons. I is not me, someone else in Colorado prisons with reforms that have taken place in the past few years and the decline in outside managed prisons. So is that a piece of it? The outside managed prisons are declining in number? Is that an impact to it?
I'm not sure I understand that question, Pauline. You'll have to kind of help me with that again. I'm sorry.
So it's about improvements in Colorado prisons with reforms and the decline in outside. I assume that means privatized managed prisons.
Okay. Yeah. I will tell you. I understand the wanting to eliminate private prisons, and of course, I'm supportive of that. I think one of the best ways to get rid of private prisons is to reduce prison population overall. That's then you have some empty real estate and you close them up, and that's the best justification to close private prisons, is when you really don't need them. There have been there is one particular facility, a private prison, I can't remember the name now, that did close more recently. We still have 3 of them, if I'm not mistaken, maybe 4 private prisons. And some of them, incidentally, house individuals from other states. And that's kind of how they keep their beds full. I know it's a profit-making industry, it's kind of gross. And there have been some reforms for sure. As I said, I really do think Director Williams is trying to make some different training, different culture within the prison system. And I think it's a long road, but he's certainly doing his best and making some inroads.
Okay, so we have a bunch of them that I'll come to in a minute on police training, but there was a more general one that's interesting as well. You didn't talk about education, which seems to be the basis of the beginning of inequities. Do you see education as has a role in this as well? I assume you do.
I totally do. You know, the education world is not in the ACLU lane per se, but I don't disagree that if you look at the race gap and the education gap that we have in schools across the state, number one, not only is there a gap on whether you're at grade level or not, but there's also a huge gap in funding. And that's all a school funding question that our state legislature battles with all the time. I don't know nearly half of the intricacies in that, but I don't disagree. I think the racial inequities in education, over policing, and then the juvenile system is even really more stark. It is fascinating. It was a couple of years ago, it was an outside entity that came in to evaluate our juvenile system. And they looked at all offenses across the board for things that youth were in detention for. And they cut out across race lines, ethnic lines, age lines, same crime, same exact crime, almost committed in the exact same place to the exact same degree. White kids, they don't go to detention for very long. Black and brown kids, they go for a long time. So those sorts of things start very, very early.
Okay, so we have quite a few questions on police training.
Sure.
So one person said the 2021 legislation is good, but it focuses on what police should not do. And they watched a Denver police recruiting video, which has a militaristic bent. How much are we asking police to be training in communication and conflict negotiation, to be taught about empathy and compassion? That's a little tie over to the education one from the before.
Yeah, I think this is interesting because I agree 100%. I mean, one of the things that we are able to do through legislation is, for example, one of the things that Senate Bill 217 does is it really mandates using only the amount of force that is necessary, and that it's an escalated type of thing. So you start out at 0, no force communication, and then you warn the person of it's going to go up little by little, and every time the use of force escalates, that you actually inform the individual. So that can be legislated. I think the culture within the police department is a different thing, and that's one of the things that we talked a lot about in the deliberations over Senate Bill 217, is that you cannot legislate goodwill and culture. What I think this question also brings up, in the defund police debate, there's a lot of talk about how you don't need police for certain things, that you can send a mental health person, and Denver has the STAR program, which the 911 operator, because of their training, tries to discern what is really the issue that you are calling about. And if it is something that doesn't need police, the 911 will dispatch a a community responder, and it'll be a mental health person, a social worker, a nurse, a doctor. And they have finished up a 6-month pilot program in Denver, and they finished off a 6-month study of it. And there was only one incident in those 6 months by this STAR program that police were ever even called to follow up. And no one was hurt, no one got killed, no one got arrested. And so I think there might be more there to spend more community dollars on community responding to people in mental health crisis or other areas where the last thing you want is someone with a gun to show up.
Right, that's for sure. So another question is, why isn't uniform training for officers outside of the police department's own internal training one of the goals you listed in the 2021 legislative session? And then sort of one that goes with that is, who's responsible for retraining police to not use deadly force?
The training happens at the local level. So it is the employing agency. So, Littleton Police trains Littleton Police, and that's true across the state of Colorado. And they all have, they each have their own police academy, and then they have their own training. There have been some police departments since the passage of 217 that have asked us to review some of their use of force policies. And, we're not necessarily the experts on developing the actual policy, but it does give us an opportunity to maybe try to steer them in a direction that's more prohibited of the use of excessive force. So, but it really is the job of the local police department and the local sheriff's department.
Is there any way to make that more uniform training? Could that be a goal?
I don't know what there, I should say that there is some training that is uniform. We have a post board, which is a police officer standards and training board. They operate under the Colorado Attorney General's office, and they do have things that are the floor of what every police officer has to know and has to be. That's how you get certified, is the post board certifies you, depending on training and testing. But some of the on the ground training happens at the local level.
So European countries require at least a community college degree for police. Do you think that would help? And is there any talk about vetting people who go into military and police academies to determine their propensity to anger? So they're sort of tied, education and propensity to anger.
Yeah, there is a vetting process. I mean, most, like in Denver and Aurora and other places, there is like a civil service commission that looks at all of the applicants to get into the police academy. And, there can be red flags. I've heard commissioners say, they've had a lot of speeding tickets or a lot of, obviously assaults or whatever would be a flag that is someone that you would have to reconsider for police academy. I don't know about the education piece. I think that's a little bit more complicated. I don't know if there's been any data that tells us that individuals who have a higher degree are less apt to use excessive force or less apt to have complaints filed against him or her. So I'd want to see the data on that before I make any true conclusions.
Which is the perfect segue into the next question. Can you speak more to the need for more or better data? How can the police evaluate their own performance, let alone the community without data? So
yeah, I think one of the biggest pieces, and admittedly, if you look at the fine print of Senate Bill 217, it's pretty extensive on what it wants police to do at the local level. So it's every time an officer has a interaction with a community member, they have to jot down the person's perceived race and or ethnicity, the person's gender, and the purpose of the stop. Did the stop lead to a search? If so, what did you do? Did you cite them? Did you arrest them? There's a whole lot of things. Did you when they unholster their gun? all sorts of things like that are being asked to be recorded or reported in Senate Bill 217. And I think much to what I was saying earlier, that there is a lot of suspicion of police that they do racially profile, and I think it's true. And so I think the data itself will speak for itself, and we'll just have to see what that data looks like.
So just to let everyone know, there's a few comments in the chat that you might want to look at. One of our participants said ProPublica just published a piece after interviewing a number of Capitol Police who were furious about how little their leaders had shared intelligence and expected a large, possibly violent crowd. So there's a link to that if anyone's interested. Let's see, sorry, just get back to the other one. Another is the in-department training, which is controlled by the administration, is where the culture in the department is instilled in new officers, and it is not uniform from department to department. I think that's where change first occurs, can be more like a hazing process and should be more professionalized into a culture. Which leads a little bit to this too. What are the beginning and top salaries of police? I don't know if this is something that you have off the top of your head.
I don't actually. I just saw that come up. I don't know the answer to that. I knew it for Denver a while back, and it's kind of one of those things, first in, last out. So I had to fill that space with some other piece of information, and so that went out. I don't remember anymore what it is.
And another comment.
Oh, look, there you go. There's somebody that knows it. That's awesome.
Oh, good. Yeah, that's what happens often. We get the answer in the chat sometimes, which is great.
So recruit 58,000 all the way up to 129. There you go.
Yeah, not terrible. There was another comment that the rep whose sheriff's office employs some mental health professionals like Starr in Denver, but both they and the deputies show up at about the same time. So that was another comment.
Yeah, and I think there's this debate too about whether or not, the STAR program is community response without police. I think some communities are trying a hybrid of that, which is co-responder, police with community. And I think there hasn't been enough time for some of these pilots to really collect all of the data, but the CAHOOTS program in Oregon, in Eugene, Oregon, is probably one of the most infamous that has been doing just the responder program, and has a lot of really good data that communities showing up alone without law enforcement, whether uniformed or not, seems to have better results. And I think it's all like maybe what we've been talking about a little bit is police are trained to be police. And so I think their response to conflict is what they've been trained to do. And that is different training than someone with social work or mental health type of training. I just think it's different, and you're going to have a different result as a result.
So this question goes back to vaccination, and what do you know if there's any polling on how many Latinx or Blacks will not or maybe might get the vaccination? I think there's some general feeling that there's hesitation there, but is there any polling to support it that you know of?
No, the governor's office through CDPHE, Colorado Department of Health and Environment, has not done real polling on numbers of folks that are hesitant, although it's more a general feeling that there is more hesitancy in the Latinx and African American community. But one of the things that they have found, supposedly in my conversations with them, is they have found that the messenger matters. So they really trust their own other community members. They do trust medical professionals that look like them. And so I think one of the things that I believe were missed in the vaccine rollout was having those sort of messengers already ready to go, instead of now where it seems like we're playing a little bit of catch up. And I think also what has happened is, and again, I'm sorry that I'm so Denver centric right now, but it's only because it was in my neighborhood that there were some of the representatives and other elected officials that put together kind of their own community vaccine thing. It was headed by Senator Julie Gonzalez and Representative Serena Gonzalez Gutierrez. And they did one at Servicios, which is a community center that people know, and they had lines of cars and people that were really anxious to get there. So I think a lot of this, I think we will, I don't know that the community will catch up to its proportionality, but I think it will do better with those kinds of outreach methods versus come to the Pepsi Center and wait in line. Or wait for UC Health to contact you. I don't know. I know there's a lot of people that are waiting in different lines. And there was one person that on Facebook I saw that said at UC Health, their dad was 18,350th in line. And so they went to Servicios for theirs, and they got it in an hour and a half. So it can be done.
Yeah, which is encouraging. CDPHE does have nice graphs on their website too about racial disparity in testing and vaccines, which is nice to see if anybody's interested.
Yeah, that's generally where I got a lot of the numbers that I presented this evening.
I think that might be the end of questions unless there's others coming in or people who want to unmute and talk. If not, I'll hand it either to Marty or Sue.
Well, I do have a question, and I can't seem to get it to get to you, Pearland.
Okay.
That's okay, Nancy. Just throw it out there.
What can I do? And that's the inclusive I. What can we do to make a difference?
My organizers at the office would be appalled that I didn't have a call to action at the end of this presentation. So don't tell them, don't tell on me. I'm going to, you know what I'll do, and I'll send this to either Susan or Andrea tomorrow, but we have a couple of things that are happening. One is we have a redemption campaign where we are trying to push the governor to release more people from the prison that can be released safely. And so we have an action page for that where you can sign an email to send to the governor. We were fortunate in early January to actually have 3 Denver Bronco players that did an ad directed at the governor to exercise his clemency power. And it was some really good stuff, and you can see the ads on our website. The other thing, Nancy, and for all of you, the inclusive you, is we'll want you to be involved in our legislative efforts. There may be some that really will need more people power behind than others, and get on our email list and sign up, and you'll get action alerts on a regular basis. We need help from all different parts of the state and different communities, and putting pressure on the governor and your electeds is something we would really ask for your help and appreciate.
As another aside comment, some of us are related to churches, synagogues, whatever. And it seems like I'm a Presbyterian, and it seems like our denomination is focusing on these inequities. And the fact that it's said that at 10 o'clock on Sunday morning is the most segregated hour in the United States of America. And that probably is still true, even though it's a quote from many years ago. We need to work communally on this issue, on breaking down racial barriers between Blacks, Latinos, whatever. Why do we hate? We don't hate. We don't need to hate. We need to appreciate. Thank you.
No, thank you. I appreciate that. I was going to real quickly answer this question in the chat that there's a really, really amazing program in Aurora called the Second Chance Center that
Yes.
Hassan Latif heads. And he really helps with integrating folks into community once they are released from prison. There's also a new one that I heard of that's really called Reentry, and it's out of Loveland. I just heard about it over the weekend. But these programs, the one in Loveland works a lot with women, and Second Chance Center is not exclusively male. They just happen to have more men. But they help them get on their feet and give them training programs, and you can donate clothes, by the way, for work clothes for either men or women to the Second Chance Center, and they try to get folks integrated. And Hassan Latif himself is a former inmate. He spent quite a few years in a Colorado prison, and he's really doing his part. It's an amazing program. I really encourage all of you to learn more about it, and maybe even have him come and talk to you about the kinds of things he's doing.
That's a great idea.
Hey Denise, this is Fran. Good
Hi,
to see
Fran.
you, by the way.
Nice to see you.
My son does deliveries, and he said he was out at Jefferson County, you know, the Taj Mahal, and was making a delivery to the sheriffs. And as he was leaving, he noticed this guy had been released, you know, from jail, only had a t-shirt on and was waiting for his Uber, and it hadn't come, and he was just freezing out there in the weather. And my son, Matt, noticed and asked him what was going on. And he says, well, they won't let me wait in the lobby, and I have to wait out here. And the car hasn't come. So my son took him, you know, to where he needed to go, and bought him a meal and took him home. But one of the things that needs to happen also is figuring out a way to have some kind of a fund, because the stipend that's given by definitely the Department of Corrections is less than $100. And then if you're also releasing them from jail in the counties, and, you know, and not taking into consideration the condition outside, that's also pretty awful.
I would agree. I didn't realize that they would not allow you to wait inside when it's
Right.
cold. One of the issues there, Fran, as you know, is that they, you know, because release times can be all over the board. Yeah, you can be released at 2:30 in the morning or 3, and there not going to be any cabs out. There's not going to be necessarily an Uber driver that's up at that hour, or wherever you are, wherever they are. There's a lot of issues related around release times, and so that's an interesting thing that might be worth asking some of the counties if that's the norm, that you can't wait inside.
Right. And also figuring out a fund or something for prisoners, because the stipend that's given is just horrible. And it was horrible when I was in the legislature, and I don't think it's much better.
No, and they give you your little gate fee and you're out, and that's really it. And it's kind of amazing. I on January 15th, I went up to Sterling. The ACLU has, in its redemption campaign, caught on to the story of Mr. Anthony Martinez, who is 84 years old, and he had spent 36 years in prison for stealing some cars. And he was sentenced under a draconian law that we have here in Colorado, and it's a habitual criminal statute. So if you're someone who commits a crime more than once, you can go to prison for a very, very long time. So if you are someone who, for example, assaults an individual or even kills them, and it's not intentional and it's a manslaughter, you can get 10 years in prison. But if you do another crime 3 times, you can go away for life, which was how Mr. Martinez was sentenced for as long as he was. He's 84 years old. He has renal failure. He relies on a wheelchair to get around. He's hard of hearing. He has onset dementia. And he requested clemency 3 years ago, and that clemency petition sat on Governor Hickenlooper's desk and on Governor Polis's desk until until December 23rd of 2020, when the governor finally released him from prison, and he came out on January 15th, and I went up there with his niece to pick him up. And yeah, they don't give you anything. They give you a bunch of papers, and they try to explain them real fast, and that's kind of the extent of it.
Are there any other questions? Anybody else have any? Unmute yourself and ask other questions if you have them. Or if something comes up, this is Sue Stark talking, that you think of afterwards that you would like me to direct to Denise by email, I'll be happy to do that. And then we can get it out through Fran, Denise's answers, or if there are websites or things that would be helpful for any of us to access, that would be fine too. I'll be a go-between for that. I really want to thank you, Denise. This was terrific.
Well, thank
Really
you.
appreciate it, and very accessible, not you know, lots of details on your PowerPoint that we have to absorb, immediately, things like that. This was accessible, and I think was a way to help us intellectually understand a lot of issues, but also the heart of things that are happening. And I think that's probably true about ACLU, that you are legal wonks, certainly. But I think there is also about ACLU and other organizations that look to represent the rights of people who are often not heard in our society, that come from your hearts. And we appreciate you. We're glad you're there. And I think it would be great if we could, through Fran, we could be on your action alert when legislation comes up that you're sponsoring or supportive of. And we do action alerts to all of our members. So I
Perfect.
think there would be a way to link us with you.
I
Thank
think
you again so much.
Oh, and thank you, Susan, for your support for the ACLU. It's much appreciated. And thank you, all of you. Thank you. I really enjoyed this very much. Have a good night.
Thank you. Take care.